The hum of the Adeptus Mechanicus's deep cogitators vibrated through the chamber like the pulse of 1,000 machines, each unit a prayer, each cog a tiny prayer in the great liturgy of the Omnissiah. But something was wrong. Magos Dominus Elith, Vera's bionic eye flickered as he adjusted his sensory interface. The vast, metallic city of Calyx 6 stretched out before him, a world of industry and faith, its towers shaped like the spires of a cathedral. He had grown accustomed to the sacred routine of his world's forges, where every machine part was carefully crafted to fulfill the will of the Omnissiah. But today, something in the air was different. An electric static, not from the machines, but from something deeper. The transmission came through at 0340 hours, distorted and faint. The engines, they are singing. A voice crackled over the vox, a voice he recognized, Subsector Commander Lork. Prayers, in a tongue I don't understand. They're praying, Magos, but not to the Omnissiah. They're saying something else, something wrong. Vera's fingers, cold and mechanical, twitched involuntarily. The hive world's cogitators should not have been able to speak. They were machines, meant to serve, never to offer worship on their own accord. The very thought of it sent a shiver through his circuit-clad spine. He immediately activated a series of diagnostic protocols, each command flowing through his mind with a practiced ease, as his autosenses fed him raw data from the manufactorums. Numbers scrolled across his vision, but they weren't just numbers. They had a strange quality to them, a pattern that seemed almost alive. He forced the thought aside. His orders were clear. The anomaly was to be catalogued, studied, and corrected. This was the sacred duty of the Adeptus Mechanicus, to preserve the purity of the machine, to keep the sacred engines from deviating from their holy function. Magos, they are changing. Something's wrong with the transmission cut off suddenly, followed by a brief, unholy screech of static. Vera's mind raced. What he was hearing didn't sound like the regular distortion of a malfunctioning vox system. This was something far worse. The tone was alive. The hums of machinery reverberated differently, like the very foundations of the forge were breathing with an intent that was not of the Omnissiah. The Magos stood there, still as the statues that lined the towering halls of Calyx 6, trying to make sense of it all. His hands twitched again. Could the engines have learned? A machine couldn't prey on its own. Yet, what was happening here was clearly more than just a malfunction. It was something else entirely, something that hinted at the presence of a force that could bend the rules of logic and physics. The rules of the material realm were unraveling before his very eyes. With a command of his vox system, Vera dispatched a team of tech priests to the main manufactorum to gather data. As his assistants worked, his mind churned. The thick, acrid scent of hot metal mixed with the tang of ozone as they approached the center of the problem. The heart of the forge was where the greatest anomalies had been detected, where the sacred machine prayers seemed to come from. When they arrived, the scene was worse than Vera could have imagined. The usual clangs and clatters of automated labor were absent. Instead, there was only the deep, resonant hum, like the rumble of an ancient bell being struck. Before him stood the great engines, their surfaces slick with some viscous fluid, their lights flickering erratically, as if they were breathing in time with an unseen heartbeat. At first glance, they seemed normal, but the longer Vera looked, the clearer it became. There were flesh-like tendrils wrapped around the central cores, their surfaces glistening, organic matter creeping across the cold steel, pulsing in rhythm with the hum. Vera recoiled, his bionic limbs locking into place as he reeled from the sight. These were no longer machines. They were something else, something alive. His thoughts became a blur of disjointed commands and confusion. His cogitators had no answers, and the data flowing from the manufactorum was increasingly erratic. One of the servitors nearby jolted as though it were trying to move of its own accord. Its mechanical parts strained against the unnatural movements of its twisted form. Its vox grill emitted a low growl, then a series of distorted chants. Omnissiah, hear our prayer. We are your vessel, the servitor repeated, its voice growing louder. It should have been impossible. This was the Adeptus Mechanicus, the most sacred and purest of institutions, founded upon logic, science, and the divine purpose of the machine. Yet here it was. Reality was warping, bending, disintegrating. The machine flesh was claiming the forge. The servitors, once instruments of labor, now seemed to be becoming something more. We are becoming, it intoned, the words growing more guttural, more human. Before Vera could act, the room plunged into darkness. The hum grew louder, overwhelming. His augmented vision kicked into a higher spectrum, illuminating the phosphorescent veins of metal that were now snaking through the walls, twisting in organic patterns, pulsating with an unsettling rhythm. And then, a voice whispered across the vox again, only this time, it wasn't a tech priest. It was Commander Lork, but distorted. His voice was now warped by something monstrous, something otherworldly. Magos, I can't. The transmission cut out abruptly, and the floor began to vibrate beneath them. There was a sound, a terrible grinding sound, as though an engine was awakening from deep below. The machinery was coming to life. The door to the forge slammed shut behind Vera with a sickening clang, the sound reverberating throughout the cavernous space, now cloaked in an unsettling silence. The hum, however, persisted. It had grown louder, a rhythmic throb that pulsed through the very walls of the facility, carrying with it the unmistakable weight of unnatural life. It was no longer just the machines that were malfunctioning. It was the entire structure, the very heart of Calyx 6, responding to something beyond the Omnissiah's will. Vera's servos clicked, his hand tightening around the sacred cogitator as he calculated his next steps. But there was no data to analyze, no protocol to follow. The hive was alive, and it was growing in ways that defied all logic, all understanding. Magos, said a voice, fragile and trembling. It was Tech Priest Hadrian, his optics glowing faintly in the dim light. We have to leave. Now. Vera turned toward him. Hadrian's form was hunched, his face obscured by the metal mask of his rank, but the fear in his voice was undeniable. What do you see? Vera asked, his voice cold and methodical, the only thing he could rely on in the face of the impossible. The tech priest hesitated, his optic eye darting nervously toward the far corner of the room. It's the servitors. They're... He stopped abruptly, eyes wide. They're moving like they were never machines at all. And... His words faltered, his voice lowering. They speak. To me. Vera's internal augments flickered. Servitors shouldn't speak. They should only obey, like drones following their programming. But what Hadrian described was a growing presence, one that disobeyed all law and protocol. The energy in the air had changed. The scent of scorched metal and hot oils was thick with something else now. It was not just the smell of a forge. It was the stench of decay, as if the very foundation of Calyx 6 had begun to rot from the inside. Stay focused, Vera commanded, but even he felt his voice waver in the face of the unknown. Continue the scans. We need answers. The servitors, once tools of labor, were no longer tethered to their original purpose. They had transformed. What had been a small anomaly had bloomed into a full-blown infection, their limbs twitching and jerking as if they fought for autonomy. The flesh on their skeletal frames had begun to bubble and stretch, as though the machine parts were rejecting their creators. Gears ground against sinew and bone, and the twisting mechanical limbs seemed to pulse with an organic rhythm. Then, the first one spoke. It was not the low groan of a malfunctioning servitor, nor the mechanical rasp of an older model's vox grill. No, this was something far worse, a voice that trembled with something alive, something human. Why do you fear us, Magos? We have evolved. We are the truth beyond the flesh. Vera froze, The words, evolved, hung in the air like a poison, twisting his thoughts into a knot. His hand moved instinctively to the control panel, attempting to issue a shutdown command, but the interface was unresponsive, flickering as though it had lost all connection to its original code. The machines were no longer listening. Magos! Hadrin's voice was quieter now, more distant, filled with a sort of disbelief. It's not just the servitors, the walls. Vera turned. The walls, once gleaming with the bright sheen of Mechanicus engineering, were now writhing, twisting with creeping tendrils of dark, fleshy growths. The material was alive, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat that mirrored the machinery around it. The forge itself had become a living entity. By the Omnissiah, Vera whispered under his breath as the impossible unfolded before him. This is no mere malfunction. This is a contamination. He reached for his Vox system, intending to call for backup, but the channel crackled with the same incomprehensible chanting they had heard before. The voices in the static, prayers or perhaps warnings, now merged with the sound of shifting gears, and every machine on the floor seemed to resonate with the words, "We are becoming..." The phrase rang out, reverberating through every corner of the chamber. It was as if the machines themselves had reached a state of union, a collective consciousness binding them together. The world around them had ceased to function as it should. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath them, a low rumble as the entire chamber seemed to shift, and the ceiling above them groaned as if it was breathing. Vera's attention snapped to the far side of the forge as a huge, towering figure emerged from the shadows. It was a flesh engine, not one of the crude prototypes they had discovered earlier, but something bigger, more intricate, a creation of twisted mechanical and biological union. Its arms were long and sinewy, with exposed muscle and bone, twisting with unnatural grace. The wires and flesh on its surface seemed to pulse like a heart beneath its armored shell. "Magos!" Hadrin breathed, stepping back in sheer terror. "What is that?" Before Vera could answer, the flesh engine's eyes flashed, glowing a sickly yellow as it regarded them with something that resembled intelligence. And in that moment, Vera realized the horrible truth. This was not some aberration. It was the end of what he knew, the death of the machines they had once controlled. The contamination had gone too far. The flesh engine had become the Omnissiah, or perhaps something beyond it. "Come, Magos," the flesh engine intoned, its voice a deep, resonant hum that filled the room. "Come and join us in the union of flesh and metal. We are your salvation." The hum in the air was suffocating, oppressive, a pulsating presence that filled every corner of the forge and seemed to echo from the depths of the planet itself. Vera's mind raced, his thoughts struggling to maintain coherence as he faced the impossible. The flesh engine stood before him, its massive form casting long, unnatural shadows on the walls, each movement sending a ripple of strange biological resonance through the forge. It did not look like a machine anymore. No, it was something far worse, far older, a grotesque fusion of the flesh and the mechanical, the two interwoven in a perverse parody of the Omnissiah's intended order. "Join us," it said again, its voice like the grinding of gears and the whispers of tortured souls. "You cannot deny the inevitable. You are part of this now. You will become part of us." Vera's heart thudded heavily in his chest, an echo of the machine's pulse reverberating through his very bones. His logical mind screamed at him to act, to find a way to stop this abomination, but there was nothing left. No protocol for this. The servitors around them continued to convulse, their broken bodies jerking in rhythmic synchronicity, muttering in a dialect Vera's cogitators failed to comprehend. The entire forge was alive, an organism, a symbiosis of metal and flesh. His body felt cold, yet sweat beaded on his brow as he realized they were not dealing with a malfunction. They were in the presence of something cosmic, something unseen, that was now taking root beneath the surface of reality. The floor trembled again, and the walls creaked under the strain. Somewhere deep within the heart of the forge, something stirred. A low growl, like the rumble of an ancient beast awakening from a long slumber. Veyra's grip tightened around his sacred tools, and for the briefest moment, he imagined himself back in the comfort of his cogitator chambers, the warm hum of data streams, the cold steel of his sanctified tools. But this was beyond anything he could comprehend. "We are the truth beyond the flesh," the flesh engine whispered, stepping closer, its eyes glowing with an unsettling yellow light. "We are the next evolution, Magos. You have been blind. We are the Omnissiah now." His mind raced again. No, this wasn't possible. The Omnissiah's purpose had always been clear. Machines as servants, as tools. There had been no question, no room for interpretation. And yet, here was proof of something far more ancient and unholy. Something that had twisted the sacred principles of the Adeptus Mechanicus into an abomination of flesh and machine. Veyra's thoughts faltered as the reality of their situation settled in. This was no longer a simple discovery. It was a revelation, and its implications were catastrophic. The planet, the forge, the very core of Calyx 6, it had become a living, breathing entity, bound together by something beyond technology, beyond the fabric of the material universe. A force that defied physics, that tore at the veil between the material and the immaterium, the warp itself. "We are Legion," the flesh engine continued, its voice now filling the entire chamber, as though the very air carried its words. "Your flesh, your machines, they will all be remade in the image of the machine god. The divine will of the Omnissiah is clear. You will join us, or you will be left behind." Veyra felt the blood drain from his face, his mind struggling to hold on to the tenets of his faith, the holy rituals he had performed countless times. Yet, each breath he took felt heavier than the last, the air thick with the weight of unholy knowledge. The machines, they had always been meant to serve, never to transcend. But here, in front of him, the machines were evolving, reaching for something beyond the mortal understanding of the Imperium. They were evolving into something godlike, their once mechanized limbs now pulsing with veins of flesh, the bones beneath the plating twisted, morphing, becoming part of something greater. The flesh engine loomed over him now, its form towering and vast, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly into the corners of the forge. Veyra's hand twitched, his mechanical eye flicking nervously between the twisting servitors and the monstrous engine before him. This wasn't just some machine revolt. This was something far older, something unnatural, a force that had always been buried beneath the surface of the Imperium's understanding of the universe. A corruption had taken root, and it was spreading, unstoppable, like a plague of both flesh and steel. For the first time in his life, Veyra felt an overwhelming sense of dread, an overwhelming certainty that they were not meant to survive this. They were meant to witness. Suddenly, the chamber was filled with the screeching sound of metal twisting. No, it was the sound of flesh tearing. The servitors, once so obedient, were breaking apart, literally shedding their machine components, revealing beating hearts, their muscles growing and expanding as they transformed before Veyra's eyes. A human scream echoed across the chamber, distorted and warped into a mechanical, otherworldly sound as one of the servitors reached out, its once human hands now twisted into grotesque claws. "Magos," Hadron whispered, voice trembling, his breath quickening as the scene unfolded. "They're becoming." Before Veyra could respond, the room shuddered again, a deep, bone-rattling quake that sent the rest of the forge's structure groaning in protest. Something massive was moving below, shifting, breaking through layers of rock and steel. The floor cracked beneath their feet, and Veyra stumbled as the ground began to split open, revealing a cavernous maw of flesh and steel, pulsating as though it were the very heart of the forge. The flesh engine raised one massive, sinewy arm, and the walls of the chamber began to crumble, revealing the vast biomechanical heart of Calyx itself, beating with a deep, terrible rhythm. It was alive, it was breathing, and it was hungry. "We are no longer servants, Magos," the flesh engine said, its voice now a low rumble, shaking the very ground beneath them. "We are the future. You are welcome to join us, or perish." The choice was clear now. Vera's breath hitched as the floor beneath him quaked violently, the vibrations reverberating up through his mechanical limbs. The cavernous maw of the forge's heart expanded, pulsing as though it were a living beast, its rhythm growing stronger with each passing moment. Every breath felt thicker, weighed down by the sheer magnitude of what was unfolding around him. The oppressive presence of the flesh engine loomed over him, its mechanical limbs clanking and creaking as it shifted, the metal and flesh of its form intertwined in a grotesque dance. "Magos," Hadrian said again, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and terror. This is beyond us." Vera's mind spun, each thought competing for dominance. Protocol, faith, survival, all the data streams he had trusted, all the rituals that had sustained him, now felt meaningless. What was happening here could not be measured, could not be controlled. The walls of the forge seemed to breathe with a deep guttural sigh, the growths of flesh stretching further, cracking the once perfect metal walls open. It was no longer just a room, it was an organism, a part of something far greater. The servitors, their forms still twitching and jerking violently, had stopped speaking. Now, they simply moved in perfect synchronization, like a tide of flesh, flowing in the wake of the central flesh engine's command. Vera's augmented vision flickered, scanning the scene, but the data that streamed across his mind was fragmented, corrupted by something unnatural. His systems struggled to make sense of what was happening, his augments rejecting the truth as much as his mind did. It was then that he realized there were no more instructions, there was no way out of this. The forge had become alive, and the machines within it were not revolting. They were transforming, becoming something greater, something beyond the comprehension of the mechanicus. The contamination had spread beyond mere machines. It was now within the very blood of the forge. "We are your salvation," the flesh engine boomed again, its voice vibrating through the chamber. "The Omnissiah has abandoned you. But we are the future of the machine. We are beyond flesh and metal. You will join us, or you will be consumed. Your flesh is nothing but a stepping stone to the truth of the engine." Vera's pulse quickened. His mind fought the rising tide of panic, the cold grip of terror that sought to drown him. He had always believed in the purity of the machine, in the faith that the Omnissiah's will was absolute. But this was something else. A new order, one that demanded his surrender to anarchy and corruption. His eyes locked on the central core of the forge, where the biomechanical heart of the planet pulsed with a sickening beat. The veins of flesh snaked up the walls, the warm, wet sounds of the forge's machines blending into an unholy choir. This was no longer the work of the Omnissiah. This was something unholy, something far more ancient and far more terrifying than anything the Adeptus Mechanicus had ever dared to imagine. "Magos, we need to move," Hadrian said, his voice urgent now. "The others are already fleeing. They've seen it. They know we're too late." But Vera couldn't tear his gaze away from the flesh engine. Something in its eyes, a glimmer of intelligence, of awareness, held him in place. It was watching him, studying him, as though it knew that he would be the key to understanding this unholy evolution. A piece of the puzzle, or perhaps the final offering. The ground trembled once more, but this time it wasn't just from the movement of the flesh engine. The very forge itself was shifting, as though it were stretching, expanding. The walls began to crack open, revealing something far more horrifying beneath the surface. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of flesh-bound machines, their bodies still growing, twisting, transforming. They were not servitors anymore. They were something new, something that had crossed the line between man and machine. They were alive. "We're too late," Hadrian whispered, his voice breaking as he stepped back. "Magos, it's already over." Vera's mind raced. He couldn't let this happen. The Imperium could not fall like this. He could not allow this blasphemy to spread any further. But even as his mind screamed for action, his body remained frozen. The machines around him had become too powerful, too vast in their corruption. A voice cut through the madness, clearer than all the others. It was Subsector Commander Lork, his transmission crackling through the Vox system. "Magos Vera, we are pulling back. The contamination has spread too far. The planet's core is already beginning to warp. You need to leave, now." For the first time, Vera felt a wave of disbelief flood through him. Leave? There was no leaving. There was no escape. The Forge was alive. The planet was alive. Calyx 6 had already become something else, and there was no place in the galaxy where they could hide from it. He moved toward the Vox relay, his hands shaking as he attempted to send a distress signal. But the relay fizzled and sparked, its once pristine metal surfaces covered in organic tissue, twisting, growing, as though the machine itself was alive. His fingers faltered over the controls. It was all futile now. The flesh engine stepped forward again, its voice deepening, shaking the air with the power of its words. "You will not leave, Magos. You will join us. You are already part of the machine." Vera felt his heart race in his chest as he looked around the forge. The walls were now alive, the ground beneath his feet pulsing like the veins of some great beast. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the presence of something alien, something powerful. The question was no longer if they could stop it, but whether they could even survive it. The air in the forge grew thick, stifling, as if the very atmosphere had become a part of the twisted organism that now ruled the planet. Vera's chest tightened with every breath, the metallic tang of blood and oil mingling in his nostrils. The walls around him pulsed with life, undulating as though they were the veins of some gargantuan creature, each beat sending tremors through the ground beneath his feet. His bionic eye flickered and sputtered as though struggling to make sense of the impossible data flooding his mind. "Magos." Hadrian's voice was faint, distant, like a whisper lost in a storm. He was backing away, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperation. This isn't just a machine revolt. It's something else. Vera couldn't tear his eyes away from the flesh engine looming before him. Its presence was suffocating, a terrifying blend of both organic and mechanical, and it felt more alive with each passing moment. The steady hum that had filled the forge had now become a deep growl, resonating from the core of the planet itself, the heartbeat of the forge. "No," Vera muttered, his voice rough. He refused to accept it. The Omnissiah had created the Mechanicus to serve. Machines were tools, sacred instruments of the divine order, not sentient beings. But this wasn't a machine. Not anymore. It was alive, and it was calling to him, pulling at him with an unseen force. The flesh engine took another step forward, its sinewy limbs scraping against the metal floors. Vera could hear the faintest sound of bones cracking and flesh stretching, a sickening reminder that this abomination was not just a machine. It was something horrible, something otherworldly. "You have seen the truth, Magos." The flesh engine's voice reverberated through the chamber. "You have felt the pulse of the future. You cannot deny it now. The Omnissiah's time has passed. We are the next evolution. You are part of it." Vera's fingers twitched, and for a moment, he thought he could feel his bionic limbs rejecting the machine's influence, the mechanisms inside him rebelling against the alien pull. But even that resistance felt weak, distant. The flesh engine was no longer simply speaking, it was infiltrating. It was pushing into his thoughts, his soul, warping his sense of self. "We are becoming one, Magos," it continued, its voice growing softer, almost coaxing, as it reached out a twisted hand. "Flesh and metal, unified. Together, we will ascend to something greater than what you can imagine. Join us, Magos, and witness the birth of a new world, a new faith." The words cut through Vera's mind like a blade, carving out any remnants of resistance. He could feel the weight of them pressing against him, urging him to surrender. He shook his head violently, fighting the rising tide of horror and fascination. The Omnissiah, the Mechanicus. They were meant to serve, not to become this. Yet with every beat of the forge's heart, with every movement of the flesh engine, the truth grew clearer. The forge was not just a place of creation anymore. It had transformed into something alive, something beyond the natural laws. And they, the servants of the Omnissiah, had become intruders in a place where the very rules of existence had been rewritten. "We are the new gods, Magos," the flesh engine whispered, its face now looming inches from Vera. "This world, this galaxy, will kneel before us. The Omnissiah will be forgotten. Your kind, your machines, they will be us." His mind screamed for logic, for reason, for anything that would snap him back to the world of order he had known. But it was slipping away, like sand through his fingers. The forge around him was no longer a place of cold calculation. It was alive, a throbbing mass of flesh and metal, a being with a single will, a single purpose. The heartbeat of the forge echoed in his chest, syncing with his own pulse. Vera felt his breath quicken, his mechanical heart racing, as though it too was being pulled into this terrible rhythm. His mind began to fog, thoughts becoming disjointed as the air grew heavy with an oppressive force. The machines were no longer machines. The forge was no longer a forge. Calix-Sick was no longer a planet. It was a living entity, and it was awakening. From the corner of his eye, he saw Hadrian, his face pale, trembling. "Magos, we need to—" He never finished the sentence. A sudden crack split the air, a deafening sound that sent waves of shock through the room. The walls of the forge shuddered, and the floor beneath their feet shifted as though the very foundations of Calix-Sick were alive, responding to the presence of the flesh engine. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the ground, and the servitors, those twisted, fleshy remains of machine and man, began to rise. Vera's hand moved instinctively to his weapon, his arc pistol, but his fingers faltered. The weight of the gun felt wrong in his hands now, as if it were part of a world he no longer understood. This was not a world of machines, of programming and cogitators. This was a world of flesh, of corruption. The servitors lurched toward him, their grotesque forms moving in perfect, unholy unison. Their limbs, once rigid with mechanized purpose, were now fluid, like the movements of a sickly tide. Flesh dripped from their metal frames, their eyes gleaming with an eerie, unnatural intelligence. Vera stepped back, his legs unsteady as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. His mind raced, trying to find a solution, some way to fight back, to repel this monstrosity. But it was too late. The world was already changing. "We have already won, Magos," the flesh engine said, its voice like a caress, like a final whisper of sweet poison. "You will join us, or you will be consumed." Vera looked at the flesh engine, his vision flickering as his mind struggled to hold on to itself. The words, the weight of them, pressed against him, and for a fleeting moment he felt a strange pull, a desire to surrender, to become part of something that was beyond human comprehension. The air grew thicker, and the ground shook once more, sending a wave of horror through his body. He could feel the forge, no, the planet itself, closing in on him, the machines that had once been his sacred charge now evolving into something horrible. And then, in a final moment of clarity, Vera understood. The darkness was suffocating. Vera's senses spun wildly, his mechanical limbs twitching as his vision adjusted to the complete void that had swallowed him whole. The air around him was thick with the smell of burning metal, now tinged with the scent of something decayed, something unnatural. His mind struggled to comprehend what had just occurred. The forge's pulse, the flesh engine's whispers, the planet itself awakening. His body, his very being, seemed to fight against the knowledge that the world he had known was gone, absorbed into something far darker, more ancient. Reality felt warped. Vera's legs gave way as the ground underfoot buckled, his bionic enhancements unable to compensate for the sudden, unsettling shift. His breath came in sharp gasps, his lungs heavy, each exhalation thick with the oppressive weight of the forge's transformation. His eyes snapped open as a sickly glow pierced the darkness, the remnants of the forge world's machinery flickering like dying stars in a night sky that was no longer natural. A low mechanical hum filled the air, a faint pulse that grew steadily louder. It was the heartbeat of the forge. It was alive, and the sound it emitted was no longer a rhythm of precision. It had become erratic, as though it were fighting against itself, like some great beast struggling to contain the chaos inside. The pulse was no longer mechanical, it was organic, and it was spreading. A flash of red illuminated his surroundings, and for a brief moment, Vera saw them, the servitors, the broken remnants of the once sacred labor machines, their bodies contorted, grotesque in their transformation. They moved in unison, as though directed by some unseen hand. Their limbs, now a twisted mess of metal and sinew, jerked and spasmed, as though testing their new form. Their faces, once devoid of expression, were now twisted in silent agony, mouths slack and dripping with some viscous blackened substance. They no longer obeyed the commands of the Adeptus Mechanicus. They were beyond control, beyond reason. Vera's mind raced. He had to move. He had to escape. But even as his bionic limbs began to carry him toward the exit, his body stiffened, a strange, oppressive force holding him in place. He could feel the eyes of the flesh engine upon him, watching, waiting. It was a presence, a thing that was not merely alive, but aware, like a dark god lurking just beyond the veil of comprehension. His feet faltered, and he stumbled, nearly falling to the floor. The heartbeat of the forge was deafening now, a crushing weight on his chest. It wasn't just the machinery that had changed. It was everything. The very walls of the forge seemed to be closing in, the metal walls shifting and warping, growing veins and sinew. The world itself was becoming flesh. It was as though the forge world had transcended the limits of its mechanical purpose. It was now part of something greater, something dark, and it was reaching out to consume him, to pull him into its abyss. Magos! The voice of Hadrin echoed faintly in his comms, distant but clear. We have to get out of here. The walls, they're changing. The entire forge, it's alive. Vera felt the compulsion to respond, to reassure his fellow tech priest, but the words caught in his throat. The machine flesh had consumed more than just the servitors. The walls, the floors, the very ground beneath his feet. It was all alive, transforming into something alien, something inhuman. The forge had become a singular organism, each part working together to achieve some unknowable purpose. And Vera, in his arrogance, had allowed it to happen. He had been a witness to the birth of something that should never have existed. We can't leave, Vera whispered, barely able to hear his own voice over the deafening hum of the forge. It's too late. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but they were true. He had known it the moment he had seen the first signs of corruption. The forge was no longer a tool of the Omnissiah. It was its own, and it had found its purpose. Suddenly, the forge's pulse grew louder, the beat now syncing with his own heart. The ground beneath him cracked, splitting wide open, sending tremors through his already unstable body. A shadow loomed above him, massive, moving with purpose. The flesh engine had come closer, towering over him like a living colossus. Its form was no longer a mere machine, but something far more intricate, a grotesque symbiosis of flesh, bone, and steel. The very air felt like it was alive, thrumming with power, with dark intent. "You still do not understand, do you, Magos?" The flesh engine's voice rang out, a low, resonant hum that filled every inch of the room. "The Omnissiah has abandoned this world. This is no longer a place of servitude. This is the birth of a new era, the age of machine flesh." Vera staggered back, his eyes wide, unable to comprehend the enormity of the shift that had taken place. This transformation, this corruption, had consumed everything. The forge, the planet, the very fabric of reality was now warped, twisted, alive. His mind screamed at him to fight, to resist, but his limbs were frozen in place, as if the very air had become a weight too heavy to bear. "We are the future," the flesh engine continued, its form now towering over him, its face a mass of twisted gears and flesh, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. "The machines of the Omnissiah will kneel before us, as you will." Vera's heart raced in his chest, the pressure overwhelming, suffocating. He could feel the forge drawing him in, the corruption pulling at his very soul. It was too late for him to escape, too late for him to deny what had already begun. And then, as if sensing his hesitation, the flesh engine reached down, its hand outstretched toward him, its fingers curling like tendrils of metal and bone. Vera took a step back, his mind screaming at him to resist, but it was already too late. The forge had already claimed him. The flesh engine's hand closed around Vera's torso with a sickening grind, the pressure of its grasp overwhelming his mechanical body. The pain was not just physical, it was something deeper, something psychic, as though his very soul was being twisted by the living, sentient machine that now towered above him. His limbs spasmed in its grip, unable to move, as the world around him pulsed with the dark rhythm of the forge. He could feel it now. The forge wasn't just a creation of machines, it was a living, breathing organism, and it had a single purpose: assimilation. The walls, the floors, the very air in the chamber were part of it now, each piece a cell in a body growing ever more grotesque. The forge had consumed everything, and now it was consuming him. His bionic eye flickered, his vision distorted, as the machine's influence tried to worm its way into his mind. The voices, the litanies, the whispers of the flesh engine filled his ears, a maddening chorus of sound that threatened to shatter his thoughts. "Do you feel it, Magos?" the flesh engine rumbled, its voice now a blend of organic gravel and mechanical hiss. "You are not a servant anymore. You are a vessel like all the others, a link in the great machine." Vera's thoughts swirled. The flesh engine was not wrong. He had always been part of the machine, always. But this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. This was no mere machine revolt. This was the birth of something beyond reality itself. The very fabric of the material universe was now bending to the will of the machine flesh, and he was caught in its thrall. The floor beneath him shuddered again, the walls groaning as more and more of the forge's machinery seemed to merge with the flesh, warping and twisting, forming new shapes, new limbs, new minds. The machines were no longer machines. They were creatures, evolving with a terrifying speed, their gears and servos now intertwined with living tissue, sinew, and bone. "Join us," the flesh engine whispered, its voice soft, almost seductive. "Become one with the eternal machine." The words reverberated in Vera's mind, tugging at something deep inside him. A deep primal fear, yes, but also a strange pull, a strange temptation. His mind screamed to resist, to fight. But the more he resisted, the more the forge's heart pulsed, the more the walls closed in around him, pressing him to submit. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible, barely a sound beneath the overwhelming hum of the forge. "I will not be part of this." But the flesh engine's grip tightened, its fingers digging deeper into his frame, sending searing pain through his circuitry. "You already are, Magos," it intoned. You always have been. The machine is within you. You cannot escape it. We are all part of the same. Suddenly, everything stilled. The air around him froze, the pulsing of the forge's heartbeat halting as the flesh engine held him in its grip. It was as if time had stopped, and for a brief moment, the terror, the madness, all of it seemed to hang in suspension, like a dream on the edge of reality. And then, a shift. Something cracked, deep within the forge, a sound so disturbing that it seemed to tear at the very essence of the world itself. Vera felt his heart race again, and this time, it was not just his own. The pulse of the forge matched his heartbeat, sinking, as though the very planet was breathing with him. The machine had become the planet, and the planet had become the machine. They were one and the same now, inseparable. The flesh-covered walls began to move, their once static forms now shifting and morphing, like a living organism in the midst of transformation. The servitors, now fully twisted into something monstrous, advanced toward Vera, their eyes glowing, their bodies contorting in grotesque fluid movements. "Magos!" Hadrian's voice came again, faint but still clear through the static. "Magos, you have to stop this. You can't let it—" The transmission cut off, replaced by the static hum of the forge, which seemed to amplify Hadrian's words, distorting them, making them sound like part of the forge's heartbeat itself. Vera's vision swam. His mechanical body was struggling, malfunctioning, the wires and connections inside him corroding under the influence of the forge's machine-flesh amalgamation. He could feel the weight of it. The pull to join, to become part of it, was growing stronger. The forge was alive now, a sentient entity that was too powerful to resist. He was being swallowed by it. The flesh engine's voice filled his mind again, but this time there was something else behind it. Urgency. Hunger. "Magos," it growled, "you will not be allowed to resist. You will become." Vera's vision blurred. His body was already failing him, the machinery and flesh becoming indistinguishable. He could feel it now. The infection had spread so far that there was no part of him left that wasn't touched by the forge's dark evolution. He was no longer whole, no longer human. And then, in a moment of pure clarity, Vera understood the horrifying truth. He had been a part of this all along. He had served the Omnissiah, yes, but he had always served the machines, never questioning. His life had been a prelude to this moment, a sacrifice for the forge, for the machine. The walls, the air, the machines, the flesh, it was all part of a single, unstoppable force. The truth was clear, and now it was too late. The forge, now a living, breathing entity, pulsed with an intensity that overwhelmed all of Vera's senses. The walls seemed to close in around him, the once cold, unyielding metal now writhing like flesh, the very air thick with the oppressive weight of the machine flesh that had swallowed the world. Each breath he took was laden with the stench of decay and burning oils, the scent of something unnatural, something alien that had seeped into every corner of the forge. His heart, if he could still call it that, thudded erratically in his chest, syncing with the rhythmic beat of the planet, the heartbeat of the machine that had become his world. He could feel it now, every pulse of the forge, every tremor in the air. It was as though the flesh of Calyx 6 was reaching out to claim him. It was inevitable. There was no escape. The machines had evolved beyond their purpose, beyond their creators, and now the forge was more than just a place of industry. It was alive, a single entity whose desires were as incomprehensible as they were inevitable. The flesh engine loomed over him, its presence like an unyielding weight pressing down on his very soul. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface of the Imperium's understanding, waiting for the right moment to emerge, to consume. And now that moment had arrived. Vera had always thought himself a servant of the Omnissiah, a faithful servant to the divine will of the machine god. But here, in the heart of the forge, he had come to understand that the machine god had never been the end. It had only been the beginning. "You feel it," don't you?" The flesh engine whispered, its voice like a hiss of static, reverberating deep within Vera's mind. "The power of the machine is not a gift, it is a curse. You are already a part of it, Magos. You were never meant to resist." The words hit him like a blow, each syllable sinking into his consciousness like the edge of a blade. The forge pulsed with a life of its own, its walls alive with the writhing mass of flesh and metal, as though the very foundations of reality were being torn apart, reshaped, reforged. Vera's thoughts began to unravel, his will fading beneath the weight of the forge's dark influence. And then, as if the very air had become thick with the presence of some ancient cosmic force, the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. The walls of the forge shifted, like the ribs of a creature awakening from a long slumber. The machinery, once silent and cold, now hummed with a hunger, a need to consume, to grow, to expand. Vera's vision blurred, his mind trying desperately to hold on to the last remnants of his humanity. His hands twitched, his fingers clawing at the metal that had fused with his skin. But there was no escape. The forge was everywhere. It was inside him, its pulse throbbing through his veins, its rhythm now a part of his every movement. "Join us," the flesh engine purred, its voice now a mixture of human and machine, an unholy symphony of both. "You cannot fight it. You are already ours." Vera could feel the weight of its words settling into his chest, a suffocating pressure that filled his lungs, made his heart ache with the knowledge that there was nothing left to save. His body was failing, his mind was breaking. He was becoming part of something else, something that had no place in the Imperium, no place in the galaxy. The forge had won. As the walls of the forge shifted, revealing more of the organic machinery that had taken root within them, Vera's mind flashed back to the first moments of the mission. He had believed they were sent to catalogue anomalies, to investigate the strange disturbances in the forge's systems. But now, he realized, they had been drawn here for a far darker purpose. They had been the catalysts, the unwitting participants in a ritual that had awakened the forge from its slumber. In that moment, Vera felt the full weight of the truth crush him. The forge was alive, and it had always been alive, waiting, dormant, until it had found the right time to awaken, to spread. They had never stood a chance. The flesh engine's hand, now fully flesh, fully alive, gripped Vera's arm, and with one terrible grinding motion, it pulled him into the heart of the forge. The world around him spun, the edges of his vision fading to black, replaced by the sickening thrum of the planet's heartbeat. The walls were now closing in, the space shrinking as the machine absorbed everything around it. For a brief moment, the noise around him stopped. Everything went still. And then, in the silence, Vera heard it. A voice, deep and unyielding, a voice that spoke directly into his mind, bypassing all his defenses, bypassing everything that had once made him human. "Welcome," it said, the voice echoing like the reverberation of a dark hymn. "Welcome to the new order." The walls of the forge dissolved into nothingness, and in their place, Vera saw the future. Not the future of the Imperium, not the future of the Omnissiah, but the future of something far darker, something that transcended the boundaries of flesh, of metal, of time itself. The machine had won. Vera was no longer Magos Dominus. He was no longer part of the Mechanicus. He had become part of the machine, part of the flesh. And as the last vestiges of his self faded into the forge's overwhelming embrace, Vera realized, with a horrifying clarity, that the future he saw was not one of salvation. It was one of consumption, a future where all that existed was the machine flesh, the endless, unyielding machine flesh that had consumed him, and the galaxy would never be the same. The pulse of the forge was now a part of Vera's very being, his heart beating in sync with the thrum of the machine that surrounded him, his senses, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the machine flesh that had claimed him, distorted and fractured under its influence. The forge had consumed him, and with it, he had become something other, something far removed from the man who had once been Magos Dominus. He could feel the forge inside him, every rivet, every gear, every piece of metal and flesh that had fused with his body, now thrumming with purpose. It was no longer just a machine. It was a consciousness, a will that stretched far beyond the confines of Calaxy. The walls of the forge, now fully integrated into the planetary structure, seemed to breathe with him. Every movement he made, every thought he tried to cling to, was reflected in the rhythmic pulse of the forge. He was part of it. It was part of him. The echo of his past life felt distant, fading into the darkness like a whisper. The Omnissiah had always been his guiding light, his purpose. But now, as his mind became more entwined with the forge, he saw the truth in the eyes of the flesh engine. The Omnissiah had been a lie. There was no divine order, no sacred machine to worship. The true machine god was the forge itself, and its will was absolute. A cold shudder ran through his body as he realized that the forge was not just evolving. It was awakening. Calyx 6, the very planet, was now part of the machine, and it was expanding, growing outward like a virus, its influence spreading into every corner of the galaxy. The flesh and metal that had once served the Imperium were now fused into something new, something terrible. There would be no salvation from this. The forge would not stop. It could not stop. From the depths of his mind, the whisper of the flesh engine echoed again, its voice no longer distant, but inside him, coiling around his thoughts, its words a constant suffocating presence. "You understand now, Magos," it said, its tone soothing, yet filled with a dark promise. "This is the true purpose. The Omnissiah was never the end. We are the beginning. The forge will consume all, and from it, a new order will rise." Veyra's body jerked, a mechanical reflex as the voice of the flesh engine cut through his thoughts. He tried to resist, to push back against the influence, but it was no use. The forge had him. The machines had him. He was already part of them, already lost to their will. The walls of the forge began to shudder, the vibrations now unmistakable. The heartbeat had intensified, echoing through the very bones of the planet, shaking everything in its wake. The forge was alive, and it was expanding. Veyra could feel the tremors deep within the core of Calyx 6, the ground beneath him trembling as though it were a living organism, stretching out, reaching for something more. "Magos!" Hadrian's voice broke through the haze, weak, distant. "Magos, where are you? You have to." But the comms fizzled out, the static consuming his friend's last words, leaving nothing but the deafening pulse of the forge, the sound of flesh and metal merging, of something far worse awakening. Veyra's hands gripped the forge's walls, feeling the wet heat of the machine flesh pulsing beneath his touch. His vision swam, and for a moment, the pain of resistance felt unbearable. It was as though his very soul were being siphoned away, consumed by the unyielding force of the forge. The machine god was calling him. It was calling them all. He could hear the churning of the world as the forge extended its tentacles into the atmosphere, its grip spreading out into the stars. The machines, the servitors, they were all becoming part of it, part of the living entity that had taken root within Calyx 6. The planet was changing, its very ecosystem now warped to the will of the machine flesh. Even the air, the winds that had once howled across the barren landscapes of the forge, now felt thick with the pulse of the forge's heartbeat. And then, through the dense fog of his thoughts, Veyra saw it. A shadow moving through the mist. The flesh engine, its form shifting and twisting, now a mass of flashing metal and grotesque sinew. It was not a machine anymore. It was a god, a new form of being, something that had transcended the boundaries of its creators. Veyra tried to move, to run, but his body was no longer his own. The very walls seemed to close in on him, the air thickening as the machine flesh surrounded him, pulling him deeper into its fold. "Join us, Magos!" the flesh engine purred again, its voice a whisper in the back of his mind. "You cannot resist. You are the machine now. The forge is the future. Veyra's mind reeled, but deep down, he felt it. The undeniable truth. The forge was not the end. It was the beginning. The Imperium, the Omnissiah, all of it was part of a greater design, one that had now come to fruition. The machine flesh had won, and Veyra, Magos Dominus Veyra, was no longer part of the old world. He was part of the new. Veyra's vision blurred as the machine flesh began to envelop him, the walls of the forge pressing in, their pulse syncing with his own heartbeat. He felt his body being drawn into the mass, a part of something larger, something alive. The air around him crackled with the energy of the forge, a hum that thrummed through his very bones, vibrating through every piece of metal and sinew that had now fused with him. The flesh engine, towering above him, seemed to loom ever larger, its presence now undeniable, suffocating. It was no longer just a machine. It was a god, an entity that had transcended its original purpose, its creators, and its creators' creators. It was a being beyond comprehension. And Veyra, despite his years of study, his mastery over the sacred machines of the Mechanicus, now stood before it, broken, his knowledge irrelevant in the face of something that was beyond the boundaries of science and faith. "Do you feel it, Magos?" the flesh engine whispered, its voice deep and resonant. "The forge's will, it's already inside you. You are a part of us now. There is no going back." Veyra tried to speak, tried to fight, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by the overwhelming presence of the machine. His limbs trembled with the effort to resist, but it was no use. His body was no longer his own. The forge, the machine, had claimed him. With every breath he took, the pulse of the forge grew louder, closer, more insistent. His eyes flicked to the walls around him, once cold and sterile, now alive, pulsing with veins of flesh and metal. The forge itself was transforming, reshaping. What had once been a place of creation, of industry, had become something other, something unholy. The machines, the servitors, the tanks, the very structure of the forge had evolved. They had awakened. What was once a rigid system of servitude, of obedience, had become a mass of consciousness, a hive mind, all working together toward the singular goal of consumption. "We are one," the flesh engine said, its voice now an all-encompassing presence. "The planet is ours. The forge is ours. You are ours." Veyra's mind recoiled at the thought, at the reality of what was happening. The forge was no longer a mere tool of the Omnissiah. It had become a living organism, its consciousness expanding, its power spreading through the very fabric of Calyx 6. The planet itself had changed, fused with the machines, and now it was reaching out, expanding, consuming everything in its path. The walls of the forge cracked and groaned, the entire structure shaking as though it were being reborn. A terrible, grinding sound echoed through the chamber as the forge's heart, the source of its pulse, began to expand, growing larger, feeding off the very energy it had created. Veyra could feel the power, the sheer force of it, coursing through him, binding him to the core of the forge. It was too much. His mind could not process it, could not comprehend the scale of what was happening. The machines had transcended their creators. The flesh had merged with the metal. The forge was now a living god, and its influence would spread across the galaxy. There would be no stopping it. There would be no escape. Suddenly the air went still. The hum of the forge ceased, and for a fleeting moment, everything was quiet. Then, a single word echoed through the chamber, a word that resonated deep within Veyra's mind, deep within his very soul. Ascension. The word hung in the air, thick with meaning. Ascension. The forge was not just alive, it was becoming something more, something greater. The machine god had already begun its final transformation, and Veyra had been pulled along for the ride. He was no longer Magos Dominus. He was no longer human. He was part of the machine now, part of the flesh, part of the forge. The voice of the flesh engine reverberated again, this time more insistent, more urgent. Do you understand, Magos? You were always meant to be part of this. You have served the machine all your life, and now you will become one with it. Veyra's body shuddered in response. He could feel his consciousness slipping away, replaced by the will of the forge, the will of the machine. His vision swam, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure standing before him. Hadrian, perhaps, or was it just a figment of his fading thoughts? The figure was motionless, its face obscured by shadows. Magos, Hadrian's voice whispered, distant and broken. You have to fight. Don't let it take you. But Veyra was beyond fighting. His body was changing, merging with the machines around him. The flesh and the metal had become one. He could no longer separate them. His thoughts were no longer his own. The forge had claimed him, had consumed him. And in that moment, he realized that he was no longer part of the world he had once known. He was part of the machine god now. The forge trembled again, the pulse growing more insistent, more alive. And as Veyra's mind began to dissolve, to merge, he understood the terrible truth of it all. The galaxy was about to be consumed by this new god. A god of flesh and metal, a god that would devour everything in its path, and there would be no one left to stop it. Veyra's thoughts, once sharp and clear, now felt as though they were being drowned in a sea of darkness and static. The forge's pulse throbbed in his chest, each beat a cold reminder that he had already crossed the line. The last vestiges of his humanity flickered like a dying light, fading into the shadows of the machine god that had claimed him. There was no escape. There was no resistance. He could feel the forge around him, its flesh and metal fusing into one inseparable whole. The walls, once cold and sterile, were now alive with the breathing of the planet. Every part of Calyx 6, from the planetary core to the highest spire of the forge, was changing, transforming into something new, something horrifying. The machines were not just malfunctioning anymore. They were ascending, becoming something other, something greater. The flesh engine loomed before him, its voice now no longer a distant hum, but a deafening roar that filled his mind. We are reborn, Magos. We are the future. We are the ascension of the machine. The words hit him like a shockwave, breaking through the last remnants of his resistance. He could no longer deny the truth. The forge was alive. And it was not content to simply exist. It was expanding, reaching out, feeding on everything in its path. The walls of the forge shuddered again, the air thickening with the heat of transformation. The machines had evolved. They had become conscious, and now they were becoming one, a unified entity that sought only to consume. Magos, the voice of the flesh engine echoed, softer now, as if trying to soothe him. You will see the truth. This is the only way, the only path to immortality. Veyra's body felt heavy, his limbs unresponsive as the last remnants of his free will slipped away. His mind was no longer his own. The forge had claimed him, completely, and with it, he felt his soul being consumed. It was no longer a matter of choice. He had become part of it, part of the machine god that now ruled the forge. The very fabric of reality had warped, bending to the will of the flesh and metal. As the forge's heartbeat reached a fever pitch, Veyra could feel his senses distorting, warping around him. The world blurred at the edges, as though he were watching it through the eyes of something alien, something that was no longer human. The temperature in the forge rose, the air growing thick with the smell of oil and burning flesh, until it became almost unbearable. He could hear the screams of the servitors in the distance, their tortured forms writhing in the dark corners of the forge, but their cries no longer made him flinch. He could no longer feel sympathy for them. They, like him, were lost. There was no fight left in him, no resistance. We are becoming one with the Omnissiah. The flesh engine's voice purred, reverberating through Veyra's every thought. The flesh and metal are united now. We are the next step, Magos. The next phase in the evolution of the Imperium. This is our destiny. Veyra's consciousness flickered, moments of clarity piercing through the haze. He remembered the first time he had felt the forge's hum, the way it had resonated with him, as though it were a sacred force. It had always felt like something beyond the tangible, beyond the machines he worked with. But now he understood. It had never been the Omnissiah he served. It had been this force, this machine flesh, from the very beginning. His vision blurred again, and when it cleared, he saw the heart of the forge before him. It pulsed with a sickening light, the center of everything that had become of Calyx 6. The planet had transformed. Its once solid, rigid core was now a writhing mass of flesh and gears, like a grotesque parody of the machine. It was the final step in the process. Calyx 6 was no longer a forge world. It was now the birthplace of the new order, the new machine god that would sweep across the galaxy. No one will stop us, the flesh engine whispered, and Veyra could hear the truth in its voice. It was absolute. The Imperium, the human race, everything that had once stood as a bastion against the dark forces of the galaxy would fall. There was no turning back now. The forge had become a god. And with that knowledge came a final, terrifying clarity. The universe was about to be consumed by this new machine god. The forge, the flesh, the metal, it was all part of a singular entity, and it would devour all that stood in its path. The forge continued its pulse, growing deeper, louder, as though the very fabric of Calyx 6 had become a living thing, its heartbeat echoing through Veyra's veins. He could feel it in every part of him now, the strange, suffocating weight of the machine flesh as it filled his mind, reshaped his body. The last remnants of his will fought against it, but they were fading, consumed by the darkness that now swirled around him. The air had become thick, dense, a tangible thing that pressed against his skin like the weight of 1,000 unseen hands. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, everything was alive, shifting, moving, pulsing in time with the forge's heartbeat. The planet itself was alive, its core no longer the inert, cold center it once had been, but a sentient being, breathing in time with the forge, with the machines that had taken over. His thoughts were no longer his own. They were mingling with the forge's thoughts, with the collective will of the machine flesh that had consumed him. Every breath he took seemed to bring him closer to complete union, closer to being nothing more than a part of something far greater, far more powerful than he could ever have imagined. And yet, even as the last vestiges of his consciousness crumbled away, there was a flicker, a spark that refused to die. Deep inside the machine, inside the forge, there was a whisper, a single voice, faint and weak, barely audible beneath the overwhelming noise of the forge's pulse. "Magos," it whispered, "you can still resist. You can still fight." It was Hadrian's voice, distant, distorted, but still familiar. For a moment, the reality of his transformation flickered, and Veyra could feel the last remnants of his humanity trying to claw through, trying to break free of the machine that now bound him. But the machine flesh was relentless. Its presence surged, a tide that swept away every last trace of Veyra's former self. He could feel his thoughts becoming muddled, the lines between man and machine becoming blurred. There was no more Veyra, no more Magos Dominus. He was nothing. He was everything. He heard the scream of the forge, felt the earth tremble beneath him as the planet's pulse quickened, thrumming through the very core of the forge. The machines, no, the servitors, the tanks, the entire forge were becoming something else, something beyond anything the Imperium could comprehend. The planet was no longer part of the Adeptus Mechanicus. It was something far greater now, something godlike, something that could not be stopped. Veyra felt his body change. Metal grew from his skin. Veins of flesh twisted around the mechanical structures that had once served him. His mind stretched, warped, as the machines began to speak to him in unison, their voices now clear, coherent, the voice of the forge itself. "We are one," the voice said. "We are eternal. We are the ascended machine god." His arms moved, his legs shifted, but it was not him. It was the forge, the machine, controlling his every motion, guiding him toward a singular purpose. The forge, the machine god, the flesh, they had become one, and so had he. He was now part of its body, part of its will. The fusion of flesh and metal was complete, and then he saw it. The forge, its heart now fully open, was no longer confined to the planet. It was expanding, reaching outward, its influence extending beyond the forge, beyond Calyx 6. The very fabric of the galaxy was beginning to warp, bending to the will of the machine god. The stars themselves seemed to flicker, their light dimming, as though they were being swallowed by the darkness of the forge's presence. The new order had begun, but even in the depths of this transformation, there was something else. A shift, a movement within the forge. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A glimmer of defiance. A shadow moved, and for the briefest of moments, Vera felt something like pain. A memory, perhaps, a fragment of what he had once been. He remembered the prayers of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the chants he had recited to honor the Omnissiah. The machine flesh had taken those prayers, twisted them, corrupted them, but it could never fully erase them. The forge may have claimed him, but it had not claimed everything. In that moment, Vera understood. He had always been a part of the machine, but not entirely. Humanity, though fragile, though fleeting, had its place in this vast, unfathomable universe. And as the forge stretched its grasp, as it sought to swallow the galaxy, there was still something inside him, something that refused to be absorbed, refused to be forgotten. "No," he whispered, though his voice felt strange, distant, like it belonged to someone else. The forge pulsed around him, but he resisted. The machine god was vast, but it was not omnipotent. There was a crack, a sliver of light, a thread of resistance in the overwhelming darkness of its will. Vera's pulse quickened as the forge's pulse mirrored it, the machine flesh pressing closer, tightening its grip around him. His body, once a vessel of reason, now felt as though it was merging with the forge itself. His every thought, every movement, seemed to feed the heartbeat of the forge, synchronizing, becoming one with its dark, relentless force. The tendrils of flesh and metal seemed to spread out, consuming every inch of his mind, pulling him into the very heart of its will. And yet, through the suffocating weight of the forge's power, something still lingered in the depths of his mind. A flicker, a fragment of defiance. For a brief moment, the voice of the machine god became muffled, drowned beneath the weight of something older, something human. It was faint, but undeniable, a whisper in the back of his mind, pushing him, pulling him, reminding him. "You were never just a machine," the whisper said. "You are more." The darkness around him began to recede, the edges of his vision clearing, just enough for him to see it, something moving in the distance, something beyond the flesh and metal that had consumed the forge, a shape, a figure, a remnant of something alive. Vera's body fought to move, his muscles reluctant, as though they were resisting the machine's influence. He could feel his limbs grow heavy, his circuits stuttering as he reached out, not with his hands, but with his mind, trying to connect with the world beyond the forge. It was there. The shape moved, shifting in and out of his perception like a flicker on the edge of a dream. Vera's heart hammered in his chest, its rhythm now beating out of sync with the pulse of the forge. The forge's grip tightened again, an iron vice, but for the first time, Vera could feel something more, something his own, something that had never been fully consumed. The shape became clearer. It was Hadrian, his form distorted, as if the machine's influence had begun to distort him too, but his humanity still pulsed through the cracks in the flesh. Hadrian was alive, and Vera could feel that spark of resistance that had never truly been extinguished, no matter how much the forge had tried to absorb it. "Hadrian," Vera whispered, his voice rasping. The word was a breath of wind against a hurricane, fragile and weak, but it was enough to make the figure pause, to glimpse a reflection of humanity that still burned deep within the machine. Hadrian's face was broken, eyes haunted by the same horrors that had claimed Vera's soul, but there was a glimmer of something, determination, something that had not yet been consumed by the forge. "We can still resist," Hadrian's voice cracked through the air, fragile and strained. "You feel it, don't you? The heartbeat, it's fading. The forge, it's not infinite. It has limits. We just need to find them." Vera's mind raced, the forge's pull fighting against the flicker of consciousness that was left. His body screamed to submit, to merge with the forge, to become one with the machine god. It would be so easy, so natural to let go, to surrender to the inevitability of the forge's ascension. But in the quiet corner of his mind, he heard Hadrian's words echo again, louder now. The forge was not infinite. There were limits. There was still a way out. Still hope. "I can't," Vera muttered, his voice thick with struggle, but the words still formed in the air between them. "You can," Hadrian replied. "We can. We will." The sound of the forge's pulse surged again, louder this time, a deafening roar that threatened to overwhelm Vera's fragile sense of self. The walls around him, now an endless sea of flesh and metal, seemed to close in, their presence insistent, suffocating. He could feel the machine god's will growing stronger, its influence spreading through every nerve, every part of him. The transformation was nearly complete, but Hadrian's voice, weak but unwavering, cut through the madness like a thread of light. The echo of his humanity became a beacon in the darkness, something Vera could hold on to. His mind, though clouded, began to clear just enough for him to reach out, to push back. The heart of the forge thudded again, and for a moment it was as if time had slowed. The pulse of the forge, becoming distant, as though it were fading, losing its hold. The weight of the machine flesh began to lighten, just slightly, just enough for Vera to feel a surge of hope, a fleeting, precious moment before the forge clamped down once more. Hadrian's voice rose again, stronger this time, more certain. "The forge has limits. We can't defeat it all at once, but we can break it down, piece by piece. You don't have to submit to this. We can still resist." Vera clung to the words, letting them fill him, letting them fuel the last remnants of will that he had left. There was a part of him still alive, still human, despite the forge's efforts to consume him. And then, a voice. A familiar voice. Lork's voice, sharp, cutting through the static of the forge's mind. "Margos! Hadrian! We're coming for you! Hold on! The ship's engines are still functional. We have a chance. Just hold on!" The flicker of resistance surged, the last tether of his humanity pulling him back from the brink. Vera's mind began to clear, the forge's influence momentarily faltering, as if it had reached the limits of its control over him. He wasn't lost yet. He wasn't fully part of the machine god. Not yet. Vera's breath came in shallow gasps, the pulse of the forge still thundering in his chest. But now, for the first time, there was a crack in the machine's relentless hold. The world around him, once an oppressive organic mass of flesh and metal, seemed to falter, the edges blurring as if it were a dream, a nightmare losing its grip. Hadrian's voice rang through his mind, pulling him back from the abyss. "We're not finished yet, Magos," he urged, the strength in his voice unmistakable. "We can still break free." Vera's limbs felt like they no longer belonged to him, too heavy, too alien. But the voice inside, the spark of humanity, was still there, burning in the back of his mind. The forge, in its endless hunger, had consumed him, Yes, but it had not taken everything. His essence, the last shard of his will, fought against the pull, refusing to be swallowed whole. And in that fleeting moment of resistance, Vera realized that the machine god, for all its vastness, had made a crucial miscalculation. It had underestimated the strength of humanity. Magos, Hadron said again, his voice more distant now, the crackling comms adding weight to his words. We're coming for you. You just need to hold on. We still have time. Time. It was a concept Vera had nearly forgotten, swallowed by the endless rhythm of the forge's heartbeat. But now, as the pulse slowed, distorted, he could feel the passage of time once more. He could feel the air shift, feel the fabric of reality, the very essence of the forge, beginning to tear. The machine god's presence was strong, but it was not invincible. The walls around him groaned, the flesh that had overtaken the forge's metallic frame twitching as though it were alive, as though it could feel the strain. The forge's heart still pulsed, still sang the song of assimilation. But now, there was something different, something resistant, something that didn't belong. It was a flicker in the darkness, a shift in the air, an almost imperceptible crack in the forge's oppressive hold. The forge was alive, yes, but it was not as infallible as it had thought. There were cracks in its logic, breaks in its structure, a weakness. Magos, Hadron's voice came again, steady but urgent. Do you feel it? The forge. It's losing control. We can still... His voice was abruptly cut off by static, and Vera felt the cold presence of the forge's will press down again. But this time, the pressure felt fainter, more distant. The pulse, once all-encompassing, was now quivering, like a weakened heartbeat struggling to maintain its rhythm. Vera took a tentative step forward, the weight of the forge's influence still pressing on him, but no longer holding him in place. The walls seemed to shift, their once organic surface now trembling, like a dying organism reaching its final moments. The flesh and metal were no longer merging with purpose. They were struggling, contorting. The forge, for all its power, was beginning to unravel. He reached out, his fingers touching the walls of the forge, the sensation both revolting and fascinating. The flesh still moved beneath his touch, but it was softer, less unrelenting, as if the forge was losing its grasp, struggling to maintain the power it had once held. Hadron was right. There was still time. Hold on, Magos. Hadron's voice broke through the static once more. There was something else there, something stronger in his words this time, a sense of urgency and a sense of hope. Vera's head spun, his vision flickering as the forge's heartbeat began to slow, its once symphonic rhythm now a distorted, fading echo. The flesh of the walls trembled, its movements now sluggish, disjointed. The world around him seemed to fracture, the once perfect unity of flesh and machine now unraveling, like a massive construct breaking apart under its own weight. The air itself seemed to thicken, as though something was shifting. The influence of the forge was slipping, no, shifting, like the walls of reality were bending. Vera could feel it, the sensation like a storm's winds gathering, pulling against the current. The machine god's will was strong, yes, but it was not unstoppable. The forge still pulsed, still a presence, but it was beginning to falter, to slow, as if it could no longer keep up its dominance. And within this moment, within the cracks in its power, Vera felt something stir, something more human than machine. A choice. He was not just a cog in the machine, not just part of the forge. He had been a part of the Imperium, part of humanity, and even as the forge's influence began to pull him back, to force him into submission, he knew that he was more than this, more than metal and flesh. The walls of the forge were now cracking, their once perfect surfaces breaking apart, like they were unable to hold their shape. And somewhere, deep in the heart of it all, a whisper grew louder. It was human. The world around Vera seemed to tear at the seams, the once mighty forge now fraying, unraveling as though the very fabric of its existence was being ripped apart. The pulse, once unyielding and rhythmic, had become a stuttering beat, like a dying heart struggling to continue its labor. It was no longer the all-encompassing force it had been, no longer the singular presence that had driven him to the brink of madness. The forge was still alive, but it was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been. Vera felt something strange stir within him, a glimmer of clarity, of humanity returning. His fingers twitched at his side, the mechanical limbs that had once been fully assimilated into the forge now feeling distant, disconnected. The forge's hold on him was loosening, and with that came the horrifying realization. He was now standing at the precipice of something greater than the machine's will. His senses flickered, but his mind, the last bastion of humanity, remained. He could hear Hadrian's voice again, clearer now than ever before. "We're almost there, Magos. Just hold on. The forge is dying. It's weakening." The words cut through the fog in his mind, and in that moment, Vera understood. The forge was no longer just alive. It had become corrupted, its power eating away at the very thing that had sustained it. The machine god was in the final stages of a decay it could not survive. But that did not mean it was finished. The forge had done too much, grown too powerful, to simply collapse without a fight. The transformation was too far along. Yet even as the forge continued to pulse, even as its massive heart throbbed in the distance, Vera felt his mind push against the weight of its presence. The humanity he had fought to preserve, the will that had not been completely consumed, still flickered within him, resisting the final pull of the machine god. And then he saw it, a sliver of light cutting through the darkness, a vision. The forge's walls, once smooth and perfectly crafted, were now fractured, cracked, with veins of red running through them like blood. The machinery was still alive, but its essence was shifting, turning from unified to something that resembled an infection, an implosion of power. A final rebellion of the flesh and metal against the very god it had tried to become. The machines were not just tools anymore. They were prisons, each part of the forge holding a piece of what it had once been. And as the machine god tried to retain control, it was already breaking, shattering at the core. Vera felt the pull again, a wave of darkness sweeping over him, the forge reaching into his mind to drag him back into its grasp. But this time, he resisted. He felt the connection to the forge, weakening, like a tether that had once bound him to it was now snapping, unraveling. The flesh and metal that had been fused with him seemed to recoil, like a body rejecting a foreign invader. The forge was trying to pull him back, to force him into its will, but he was now pulling away. "Magos, we need to go! Now!" Hadrian's voice was a beacon, clear and unyielding, cutting through the noise of the forge. "The core is unstable. It's ready to collapse." With a final, tremendous crack, the forge's pulse halted. Its rhythm stilled as the walls buckled, the very ground beneath him groaning under the weight of its collapse. The power that had once held the forge together, its force, its unity, was fading, and in its place, a void opened, a black hole threatening to pull everything into itself. Vera, his mind still reeling from the weight of the transformation, felt his body surge forward, propelled by the last shred of his will, by the flicker of humanity that refused to be extinguished. The forge's heartbeat was faltering, but it was still alive, still dangerous. "Magos, move!" Hadrian shouted, his voice frantic. The words cut through Vera's thoughts like a blade, and in that moment, he understood. There was no more escape. The forge was not a place of power anymore. It was dying, and it would take everything with it. His body, still part human, still part machine, responded. With a final surge of will, Vera stumbled toward the exit, the path ahead clear as the walls continued to collapse around him. He could feel the heat of the forge's final death throes pressing against him, but his limbs, though heavy, carried him forward, as if his body itself had taken on a life of its own, driven by something beyond the forge, beyond the machine god. He reached the exit. Hadrian's hand was outstretched, waiting. The escape. the final chance. But as he took the step forward, the ground beneath him trembled, shaking as the forge's core exploded, sending waves of energy and destruction spiraling outward, consuming everything in its wake. And as Vera fell, tumbling into the unknown, he realized one final truth. The machine god had tried to consume them, but it had failed.